Hi all, my name is Laura Bivolaru. I'm one of the members of Revolv Collective who curated Photo50 this year, titled Grafting, the Land and the Artist. Today we're going to speak about new representations of the land with two of the exhibiting artists, Victoria Ahrens and Eugénie Shinkle, and with the editor of the British Journal of Photography, Diane Smyth. And I thought initially I wanted to recite your bios, but now I think that's going to be a bit boring. So instead, I was thinking about, what brings all the three of you together in this panel. And I think one of the fun facts about you is that all three of you, neither three of you, haven't started out in photography. So Eugénie, you trained as a civil engineer, and Diane, you studied literature, and Victoria, you studied printmaking.
Sculpture.
Sculpture and then printmaking. So an even longer route into photography. And I think that can really be seen into your works. And another fun fact is that you're all teaching. So Victoria, you teach at LCC. You're the MA course leader for photography.
Yep.
Diane, you teach at LCC as well on the theory and history module. And Eugénie, you are a reader at the University of Westminster and also my former dissertation tutor. So I'm going to digress a little bit from the talking points that I've sent you and building up on the first talk moderated by Revolv. I'm wondering where teaching comes into your practices. How does that influence the way you take photographs and the way you write?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
I think teaching has a symbiotic relationship with my practice, and what I really, really enjoy about it is that I'm learning as much as I'm also imparting knowledge and then the experiences that I have, and these are being reciprocated by my students, and that symbiotic relationship means that I'm constantly thinking about the ways that photography works, or just maybe expanded fields of photography, but also because I teach quite a lot into the theory units, it means that I have to think more widely about the kind of socio-political, cultural context around photography and art practice more generally. And I just find it incredibly helpful because it aids my research, it aids my own understanding. When you're verbalizing information, you're immediately finding ways to, deconstruct it and understand it better. And so that reciprocal relationship with the students is it's just brilliant. And being with fellow colleagues like Diane, Eugénie, we haven't had the pleasure of teaching together, but maybe at some stage, you never know. But it means that team that I work with, we also learn so much from one another, and we can give each other advice and help, and so all of that pedagogy plays into probably the approaches that I take in making photographs, and I use the word making rather than taking quite deliberately, and maybe we'll come back to that later.
Yeah, maybe I'll go next. I think I would agree what you say, especially because I also teach theory. So for me, I'm interested in theory anyway. I like to read theory anyway. It's really great to have that opportunity, really like a place for that thinking about theory to be, and a reason to do it as well, beyond just like pure interest. And also, sometimes I've been introduced to some bits of reading that I haven't come across myself. So again, for me as well, it's also learning as well as teaching. I've been a supervising tutor on dissertations, and I also found that really educational for me when I'm thinking about my writing. So if someone has submitted quite a long text, and you sort of think about the structure with them, and how they're getting across what it is that they're trying to say, that's really helpful as a writer as well, because sometimes it's easy to forget someone has to read this thing. Like, you yourself know what you're driving at, but you need to make that really clear for the reader. And in fact, earlier today, I saw this video from Christina de Medel giving advice to photographers on how to do editing and sequencing of their work. And she said, oh, sometimes I advise people, if they're getting a bit lost, just go away and write down one sentence about what it is you're trying to say with this series, and then that will help. I was like, oh, that's so funny, because that's what I say to the students as well. If you can't say in a sentence or two what it is you're trying to say, then it's going to be really hard to focus your dissertation. And the other thing that I would say is it's really interesting being with younger people. So, like, you know, a lot of the students have been born after the turn of the century, and they've been born into this like incredible digital landscape that I didn't grow up with. So thinking about how they perceive the world and how they think about photography is also really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, you guys have pretty much covered it all, really. The one thing that I would say, or that I would add to that, is that I work both as a writer and as a maker, and the relationship between the two is, I don't think it's something you can teach as such. It's something that has to be kind of negotiated and worked out and talked through in person with an individual. I would never want to stand up in front of a class and say, today we're going to talk about how to make a relationship between your thinking and your writing, or your writing and your making. That's the part of teaching that I find most kind of fulfilling, is getting people to explore that relationship, and also actually getting people to be a little bit freer with what they do with the camera, because all of the work that's going by us on the screen that I'm kind of hypnotized by in the monitor, I shoot most of my work on expired film. I typically shoot very quickly, unless I'm with the large format, in which case I take more time. But there's rarely a sense that, oh, I see this thing, I want to make a picture of it, and when I'm finished making the picture, it's just a matter of printing it and will be done. That taking of the photo is the beginning of a quite long journey, oftentimes. And I'd like to encourage students to be a little bit more freer in their practice, and not to kind of move too quick between what they see and what they eventually end up with. So I think slowing down and thinking and engaging with the complexity of practice as a kind of a wider spectrum of things.
Yeah.
I have a question in particular for you, Diane, because you are not just the editor of the British Journal of Photography, but also PhotoWorks, and you're writing for many other publications. So I suppose you're seeing vast amounts of photography each year, and I'm curious to find out from you whether, going back to the subject of the exhibition, which is the land, have you seen any recent changes in the way artists represent the land in recent years?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually thinking about how the landscape is being pictured now. And you can see that in the Photo50 exhibition actually. So whereas maybe like 20 years ago, landscape seemed like quite simple, straightforward maybe in photography, although I'm thinking now of examples that aren't, but anyway, we'll go with it. But in the Photo50, it's really interesting to see people thinking about the medium of photography itself, and how the way that we perceive the landscape through photography, what that says about our relationship to the landscape in other ways as well. So this is something that I'm really interested in at the moment, sort of the invention of photography and the sort of cultural landscape that we were living in at the moment that photography was invented or developed, and what shifts had happened in our culture prior to that, and how we managed to maybe distance ourselves from the landscape in such a way that we can sort of think about a fourth wall and a landscape as an image. I've been thinking about the clawed glass, which was this like black mirror that people used to look at the landscape. So you would turn your back on the landscape and look at the reflection as an image. So something to do with perceiving the landscape in terms of an image, which arose at around the same time that capitalism was really getting going. And but I think I'm not the only person thinking about this by any means. So there are theorists like Ariella Azoulay has written about this kind of thing. And then in the Photo50, the artists in many various ways are kind of circling around similar thinking. And there's also other artists as well, like Nomi Goodall, for example. She's doing a lot of work with disrupting the surface of the image and layering the image and sort of breaking up this simple, apparently simple way of creating an image to get at something else when thinking about how we think about the landscape. Yeah.
It's very funny you mentioned the Claude glass, because I just saw a video the other day, and the woman who was presenting it was saying that it's very rare as an object to find nowadays, but you could just use your phone screen because it's got the same dark texture. So I thought that was quite interesting. I suppose a question for all three of you, but when I picked the title for the panel, I picked the word new because it's quite contentious, more than to make an argument about the works in the exhibition. And I'm wondering where you stand on, the novelty of photography. After this history of the medium of almost 200 years, in which, in many ways, photography continues the pictorial tradition that it was born into, and in other respects, it challenges it. Can we still speak of new in photography, and what would a photograph need to look like or to do in order for us to think of it as being a new way of seeing?
I think I was thinking about this question a lot. It's quite a complex question, actually, within itself. But I was trying to think of whether there is something new going on right now, let's say in photography, and how. But exactly as Diane was just suggesting before, all photography, like all art, like all kind of aesthetic expressions, are contextualized by the time that they're produced in and they're made in. And so if we think about those early pictorialists, let's say, and they were really concerned with this idea of elevating, the status of photography to be on the same level as, painting, what have you. And so using material devices, so different types of paper to print on, different combination printing, so two negatives, one on top of the other. So all of these kind of techniques that they were using were in service of trying to elevate that status of photography, and that was very much the context within which they were working to maybe photograph the landscape at that time. And then if you move on and you look at how, alternative processes like cyanotypes or, salt printing or, other types of processes came back kind of with a vengeance during the 70s, when those ideas of conceptual photography were sort of breaking free from their boundaries of just being a photograph as a photograph, but actually just multidisciplinary. Anyone could use a photograph in any type of work, kind of thing. So again, that was very much contextualized by the time that those ideas were coming about, and that's why some of those ideas, I think, were sort of manifesting themselves in that way through photographic practice. And I think maybe what is new today, even though there's this kind of weird circularity in photographic history, where all of these things kind of rebound, they kind of dissipate a bit, and then suddenly alternative processes are really, really key now. Again, everybody at the university wants to learn how to do a cyanotype. You go to Photo London and you can see that loads in different galleries. So there is this kind of circularity of kind of processes and ideas being kind of reworked. I would almost call it like a spiral, where you're taking from the past and then creating something new. And obviously new technologies now with AI and virtual reality and stuff are having a massive impact on the way that we're seeing the world. I would say that one of the sort of newer concerns maybe is that there is this really layered discourse of thinking about how the making of a photograph is absolutely entwined with all the other things that are going on in the world. So I guess our context, our very contemporary context, is the climate emergency, for example. And so it's inevitable in some ways that photographers are beginning to, and you can really see that in Photo50, think about the relationship between, where those materials that they're using to create the photographs come from, potentially, or more sustainable, non-toxic practices. So I think if you can speak of a kind of new materiality, that's where the concerns are coming from. And so maybe that also manifests itself in a kind of new aesthetic, a slightly new aesthetic in this expanded field of photography, where the material and the sense of touch are sort of really coming out as prominent, ways of making in photography. I don't know if anyone else agrees or disagrees with that, but
it's a lot.
I wanted to give you a chance to speak up.
I mean, I think for me the answer is maybe a little bit more compact. That photography is sort of an infinitely mutable medium that doesn't have any real disciplinary, discursive, or even kind of practical boundaries. It's everywhere. And that ubiquity, for me, means that I can't ever put my finger on what photography is and what it was and what it might be. So the idea of new is a really slippery one. Let's just say maybe that it has the capacity for infinite novelty and newness, and that's, I think, what excites me about it. The way that it belongs to a huge kind of very complex and constantly moving ecosystem of images, technologies, ways of thinking, particular pockets of social concern. And it just never sits still.
Yeah, I guess for me, I think it's interesting to think about how people are trying to unlearn and unthink at the moment. So, like, what are some of the things that we've taken for granted for the last maybe 400, 500 years? And how might we unpick these things that are so embedded that it's quite hard to perceive them even? So I guess, I think that's maybe for me that feels quite new. But like I would agree that I think that that's partly because of climate change, because now it becomes clear that the way that we have been thinking isn't sustainable. So we have to try to not only find another way, but understand how we have been looking in a way that we haven't done in a really fundamental, deep way before.
This is something else that I think really comes out in the present exhibition, and particularly, Victoria, in your work and my work. The camera as a technology locks us into a way of seeing that's totally cognate historically with the way that the view has been built, that landscape views have been built, and of course they've got all of their own sort of political baggage that they carried around for a long time and still carry. So I think, and this is a really good example, the piece that's up on the screen now, consciously working against the technology's tendency to organize space a particular way. And again, I find that very exciting and very challenging to do.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm interested in as well. Like, what is the relationship between us and the environment that is suggested by the camera?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really insidious. The technology that underpins the camera dates all the way back to the Renaissance. So it's historically embedded, it's kind of philosophically embedded, if you want to go down that particular rabbit hole, but it's also very Western.
Yeah.
So it's problematic in any number of ways.
Yeah, I was really interested in the Photo50, actually, the work by Marie Smith, I think it is. It's based on Anna Atkins' cyanotypes. And she talks about like the history of Anna Atkins' family and how her family was a slave-owning family. They had plantations in Jamaica. I've never heard that before, ever.
Yeah.
Even though she's one of the fundamental people in photography, so you've always heard of Anna Atkins. But I've never heard of that history before. And it seems so relevant to me that if her family were involved in a particular relationship with the land and a sort of proprietorial way of seeing people and extracting resources, that's directly relevant to photography.
Absolutely, and the sense of entitlement, I think, that goes on, that certainly was probably a big part of Anna Atkins' family history, and I don't want to diss Anna Atkins, I think she was a remarkable woman, but, it has to be part of the conversation. And just kind of jump forward, I think that sense of entitlement persists in a lot of us in the way that our relationship to the land kind of takes place. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Unless,
well, if I can pick it up from there, I'm curious to find out. So, you moved here from Canada in the 90s, and Victoria, you are originally from Argentina. And I'm curious how these two countries shaped your personal relationship with the land?
Space.
Space, huge space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nobody in a
absolutely.
hive is chasing you around telling you can't go in a particular space.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, obviously there are boundaries in Canada. You can't just walk anywhere. But that if you see somewhere and you want to take a picture there, the chances of you being able to do it without being disturbed are pretty high. And when I moved to London, that was just gone. It was just not possible. And that's the piece upstairs. That's the genesis of that piece. But,
Yeah. Yes, space, definitely. But also time, I was thinking. Because growing up in Latin America, in Argentina, in order to get anywhere, it just is such a labor-intensive endeavor. It takes days, weeks sometimes, to get up from Buenos Aires up to the north. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is, some of it anyway, is based in the Altiplano, in the northern regions of Argentina, right up in the Andes, where the salt plains are. And it's such a, it's also a very precarious environment. It's an environment that really speaks of, intense heat and freezing cold at night because it's close to the Atacama Desert. And so I think all of those kind of extremes, it's almost like the things that if you go to Switzerland or something and you have you go kind of walking in the mountains there in the Alps, it's that but exploded on steroids. I mean, that's how it feels. So that encounter with the landscape for me personally has shaped my experience of it and has shaped the way that I understand it and that I live it and that I live within it in a way. And so any other landscapes become a kind of comparison or a contrast or a something that is or isn't similar to what the landscapes that I grew up in and how raw they are. And actually, because color plays quite an important role in my practice, and in Latin America the colors are just explosive as well. You go up into the Andes and you've got the 7 colored mountains. People think I'm joking when I say they are literally 7 different colors. So those pigments, those colors, and how they actually operate through the lens of the camera, or even when I'm doing camera-less type things, or photo etchings, or photogravures in situ, is a really important part of my practice, actually. Yeah.
The color as well. I mean, there's one of my pieces that's on this spiral here. It's called Tourbillon. That's a tiny, well, relatively tiny. It's one quite small area on Vancouver Island called Wreck Beach, and the variety of rock formations in that tiny area is insane. But the other thing I find that you were sort of I wanted to pick up on from what you were saying, Victoria, is the sense of humility. You are absolutely insignificant in a space that size. And that, I think, I think everybody should go and feel that, because it's a pretty remarkable feeling. And I know Tamsin Green, one of the other artists in the exhibition, her practice is walking, and she talks about almost feeling like a loss of her own identity and just merging with the landscape. And it sounds like that's something that's sort of quite similar for all of us, that sense of your own personal boundaries and your integrity. I don't mean that ethically, but I mean literally your physical integrity starting to almost dissolve.
Yeah, and I think also the histories
Yeah.
Involved, and the layers of mythology, folklore, history, whether in Argentina some of those are quite traumatic histories in the Atacama Desert, places that, where they disappeared during the dictatorship, the bones that disappeared were hidden in the landscapes because they are so vast, and they really believed that nobody would ever find, the results of these state crimes. And together, I mean, it's so complex because they're also regions where the indigenous populations that have lived there, civilizations that have lived there for millennia, have been pushed to the boundaries of these really inhospitable places. And together with all of that, you have all the mining industry. So that, so Argentina, the name Argentina signifies silver, argentum, right? And so the fact that colonial powers went over there, so the Spanish, initially to find what they thought was white gold, the silver, which is still being mined in the north of Argentina, and how that then plays into quite a few of the pieces actually here in Photo50, certainly with Hannah Fletcher's work, where you're reclaiming the silver from, from some of these processes. So I think it's such a complex and layered history that I've grown up with, and that I'm sort of trying to grapple with in so many different ways, I guess, through my practice. Yeah.
So I want to follow this, what sounds like an umbilical cord to the land, and find out from you whether this personal relationship manifests in any way into any sort of responsibility that you feel when you're representing the land. And I guess it's a question for you, Diane, as well. Like, do you think, what do you think an artist's responsibility should be when they represent the land?
Shall I go first? I feel like I'm always going first.
I mean,
I'll go
oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
No, I mean, because my answer is really, really simple. It's. I mean, obviously, I've got my own particular political sensibilities, but I think for me, the main thing I'm trying to get across in the work is to share a sense of absolute fascination and amazement. For me, it's what's the most sort of gripping is the geological history. I find that whole process of this thing that we live on forming over billions of years and turning into this remarkable ecosystem that we happily consume. I find that process just remarkable, and all of the work is about trying to kind of unpack that experience for myself and transmit some of that fascination to the viewer, over and above any kind of personal political stance about the various issues that have layered up historically on the surface of the land. That's not really what the work is about, although it underpins pretty much everything I do, really.
Yeah, and I would say that just as people, never mind just as artists, we all have a sense of responsibility.
We'd like to think,
we hope anyway, to a certain extent. I think it's not just an artist's sole responsibility, to deal with issues that are very, very complex. But I think that we're in a privileged position to be able to use kind of our aesthetic tools, maybe to convey messages or images or thoughts or fascination or whatever it is, to an audience of people that might be attracted to looking at these things.
I mean,
Sorry.
I think, and I'll let Diane speak after this, but I think a sense of responsibility can only emerge from a genuine place of fascination, respect, whatever you want to call it. I don't think any one of us can be told that we have to be responsible. We have to want to be responsible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like the sort of obvious material things to do with trying not to use photographic processes that are polluting, for example, or when you're staging an exhibition, trying to think of responsible ways that you might do that could be less like draining on the earth. I thought it was interesting what you said, Eugénie, about like in Canada, the sheer scale of things giving a sense of humility. Because like we're developing more and more ways to look at the world and the landscape, which is amazing, like satellite imaging and, everyone having cameras now. And so we have more and more ways to look at the landscape. But I suppose, like any good scientist, to sort of think that our knowledge is never complete. So just because we can see the land in more and more ways, it's still like beyond us. There's still that sort of recognition of the sublime, that we're quite small and there's no way for us to actually really comprehend the enormity of the world around us.
There's a really interesting practice in satellite imaging when it's used by scientists called ground truthing. And what ground truthing involves is people literally counting individual pine needles, for instance, on the ground, because the cameras, or the satellites can only give you a kind of a two-dimensional picture. They can't really give you this granular information about what's really happening physically out there on the ground. You've seen that book, Ground Truth, haven't you? Yeah. It's about, it goes on in all sorts of different scientific endeavors, but it's a really important part, a supplement to satellite imaging. And it involves being physically in a space and being really engaged with tiny things.
That's really interesting, because that's what Google Earth calls its headquarters, ground truth. which I think is very interesting.
It's quite ironic.
Well, very ironic, yeah. And how because in those headquarters, apparently they use all these kind of old cartographic these kind of early military maps, as well as satellite imagery, as well as kind of like counting the pine cones or whatever it is. And all of that together creates these huge amounts of data and layers and layers and layers of data through which we just think that we are basically observing the Earth from above. But actually, there's a combination of lots of different things, including maybe things which were kind of errors in these early maps that were then translated and translated and translated to the point where you look on Google Earth and there's a place called Sandy Island on it. So I'm digressing slightly here, but Sandy Island, it's fascinating. That if you look for it, it still sort of exists on Google Earth maps, but it doesn't exist in real life because it was a copyright trap that some early cartographer placed on their map that was just included in these layers of data, and it's very difficult to unpick it. So scientists told Google Earth that actually this was a problem because you were giving information, through GPS for sailors or what have you. And in fact, these places were not real, so they were trying to go around an island that didn't actually exist, let's say. And to unpick that data later on was so difficult that now if you look for Sandy Island, it's a ghost mark, it's a spectral kind of image. So I think, this idea that exactly what you were saying, Diane, that somehow new technologies mean that we think we end up always being able to understand what we're looking at, and that what we're looking at is some kind of a truth, even that word, ground truth, is always something that we need to challenge. And so I'm interested in looking at the landscape almost as a kaleidoscope, or as a kaleidoscope of images, a kaleidoscope of experiences, and that fragmentation of the pieces then means that I'm trying to piece together what I experience or what I encounter rather than what is. Because we can't take in a view like the Andes or the Altiplano in one go or at all. Even if we're in an aeroplane, we're just seeing fragments of it as it goes, in front of our eyes. So I find that kind of sort of taking away that kind of linear perspective and starting again and just encountering it in a different way, I find that really exciting.
Well, that's a great place for me to ask the next question. And Eugénie, you've touched on it just earlier, so I suppose the answer is yes. But do you think there is a relationship in between how we've represented the land historically and how we use it globally as an infinite resource?
Hard yes. Do you want to speak to this one first?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit kind of like work in progress in my mind, but the idea that you can have an image where you somehow have got hold of something and then you mistake that limited view for somehow having possessed something, but then also like the reproducibility of that. I don't know, I think there's something in that. I haven't really thought it through yet, but I think there's something in the idea that we can take the landscape, but also that it can be repeatable. So there wouldn't be like an individual tree that can never be replaced if it's cut down. There's something about the idea that
capitalism, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Like fundamentally an idea that things are products and somehow reproducible. Yeah.
I mean, historically, because I'm really fascinated with linear perspective, and I've studied it in a range of different contexts, and one of them is historical context. And this isn't my idea. There are many, many writers who've tackled this in great detail: W.J.T. Mitchell, Stephen Daniels, Dennis Cosgrove, Anne Birmingham, Barbara Novak. So a very long list of people who have traced the history of landscape representation, which is a pretty much Western thing. As being one of power, one of domination. That foreground, middle ground, background structure that looks so natural and so neutral is actually one that casts the viewer in a position of power and security, and anyone else out in the landscape in a position of subservience. And it was used during the 18th century, particularly by English landscape painters, as a way of setting out a form of social contract. Anne Birmingham is really good on this respect, if you want to read about that. And if you dig back even further, it's embedded in the way that the Western idea of self is structured. here being a perspective or a position of security and power and visibility, obviously, and over there being what you survey. And that's baked into the structure of the camera. Sorry, what was the original question?
Yeah,
sorry,
it was,
yeah, no, I got
yeah,
it.
if there
The
is a
idea of
relationship in
infinite
between
resources.
how we
Yes,
see the land
so-
and how we use the land.
So yeah, I mean, you're obviously seeing the land and using the land. To take an example, some of the pictures that Gainsborough made of landowners sitting in their landscapes. That when Mr. and Mrs. Not Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, but sorry, Andrews. Thank you. That was her family's land that he had married into, and the implication being obviously that they weren't just going to sit and look at it, they were going to make people cultivate it and make a lot of money off it. So that's baked into it as well. Power and ownership go hand in hand when it comes to the landscape paradigm. Even if we think of something like visual ownership, surveillance, the ability to look out over something and say, this is mine. That implies that anything I do to this is I'm entitled to do whatever I want here because it's mine.
It's interesting because one of the second piece that I have in the show, which is the ones with the batons, coloured batons, and the Polaroids were taken during a residency that I was on in the south of Lisbon, in Barreiro. And I find that really interesting, what you were just talking about, Eugénie, because those spaces were originally used as kind of industrial, kind of powerhouses that were going to develop and change and make Portugal very wealthy at the turn of the century. And it was a kind of utopian vision, actually, of the landscape as a product, as a tool, economic tool for progress, for enriching themselves, etc. But of course, when I was there and I started working, now these spaces are abandoned, uninhabitable, toxic, and are slowly being cleaned up. But they're very beautiful. They're spaces that are pink and green and purples and reds because of the caput mortuum, or the residue of the pyrite treatment that happened there. And they were using pyrite to create paint for boats and for fertilizers. It's still used in fertilizers today. But the people who were encouraged to go and work in that site were taken there with this vision that what they were doing was not only doing something that was great for the country, so their labor was contributing to, enrich that country, but it was also, in a really kind of sinister way, they were very controlled. So they were given education there, medical services were there, so the doctors, so they lived in this particular place where everything was given to them, so, washing machine when that was invented or whatever, but they could only spend the money that they received from that site on the products that were given to them in that site. So it became a very internal economy. And when you look at the original images, the historical images of that, it is this kind of very socialist kind of utopia that the land is going to produce wealth for everyone, when the reality was it was a complete power, disequilibrium. And the result of all of that is that now it's completely abandoned, and uninhabitable. And, and I was allowed to go in there and to pick up some of the pigments and to, to work with it and to speak to some of the very, very elderly people who still live there and who are still kind of remember what it was like, originally. So I think, that utopia, because there was that kind of sense that somehow the land was going to bring something, very particular to the world through capitalism, etc. And certainly, like, looking at it with a Latin American lens, that idea, or just an American lens, the Americas, that idea that migration, the reason why people were going there in the first place from Europe was to escape the issues like famine in Ireland or war or, persecution, and to go to Latin America because it was the promised land. Because when they got there, they were promised that they would receive and have ownership over parcels of land where they could farm and where they could, better themselves. The reality was completely the opposite. When they got there, the land was already owned, and actually they were kind of destitute. But, so these ideas of power and ownership and boundaries and, migration, they're all so intertwined in that idea of how we use the land and how we view the land.
And really insidiously, and this I think is a really important point, that they are present in representations of the land.
It's time to get some questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions. Oh, right there at the beginning, the front row.
Hi, thank you so much. Really interesting debate. I'd like to bring something we started conversation this morning, and it was about there is so much use of the word land, and we were wondering what is lost in that, if by foregrounding water or other materiality is related to our environment, even air, what could be gained from that? Because again, this representational shift would happen, and it would be maybe even a paradigm shift if we think through photographers that dealt with with other materialities, or even thinkers like Luci Irigaray, or even the whole spectrum of hydrofeminism that has been considering this possibility of articulating the repressed, the wet, the contaminated, all that.
I mean, I'm very interested in I heard your question this morning, actually, and it got me thinking a lot, because when I did my PhD was based around water, actually. So, and it was the idea that the spaces of the Paraná River, which go all the way through various countries in Latin America, and how all the multiple layers of mythology and history and colonialism and much more sinister, kind of more recent history in terms of the disappeared, all converge in this space of the river. And so what I was doing was I was taking my photographic plates and I was exposing them in the sunlight, so next to the river, and then I was using the river water, which was pretty naturally acidic, had a lot of iron in it, actually, and to develop those images. So the water was absolutely intrinsic in my experience of those landscapes. I mean, maybe land makes it sound as if it's incredibly boundaried off, but actually maybe what we mean is landscape. And also currently, so the water, in other words, became this agent that, or had its own agency to kind of work onto the photographic plates in a certain way, so I had to kind of let go of control of that a little bit. And that water, as far as I was concerned, was imbued with all of this memory of those who had disappeared or whose bodies had been, thrown onto the river there, and the forensic, I was working with forensic archaeologists and anthropologists there, and just looking at methods of how you kind of remember or memorialize. So the droplets of water that remained on the surface of the image became the DNA of that place. And then the plates were the thing that I displayed rather than maybe prints that I could have made from those plates, because they became what we call prosopopeic images. So prosopopea being a word that you use to say that an object speaks for something. So somehow that object, with my agency, but also with an embodied practice in the river itself, then was able to, let's say, speak about or of or with that landscape, and of deeper questions as well. I'm doing a project with the students at the moment about the ocean with UNESCO, and I've been learning so much about it. And I think your question about hydrofeminism and how we perceive what terrestrial areas are, let's say, and photographing the terrestrial, and then looking at the ocean, which makes up 70% of the world's, space, if you like, of the Earth, and how little we understand it, and how much we have not photographed of the ocean, except maybe from above, or and encouraging the students to reconceptualize that, because apparently it is one of the great problems with climate change discourse, is that people don't think about water as much as they should, and a lot of solutions to, and a lot of the problems of climate change come from the ocean, actually. Sorry, I digress, but yeah. Is that me?
I'm not sure.
I did a piece a few years ago where I was looking at a lot of the code that is used in climate change modeling is actually openly accessible. You can't. I mean, some of it is not the stuff that they're sort of working on and that's still proprietorial, but there are plenty of sites where you can go on, MIT, for instance, and just look at this code and read this code. And one of the things that was most, well, I mean, one kind of intuits this anyways, but the absolute complexity of these models, and the one kind of wild card in the model is cloud. Because cloud is the one sort of form, if you like, that is the most important in the amount of radiation that's reflected back to the Earth. It can also, or that goes out or that doesn't get in. And it's kind of a reciprocal process of us, because of all the particulates, because clouds take form around particulates in the air. One thing that we produce a lot of is particulates. So the cloud cover, Earth's cloud cover is incredibly kind of influenced by us. So it was just really interesting reading this code where people are trying to get their heads around, around this phenomenon that is absolutely unpredictable, and how they model something like that. And there's a kind of sublimity in that, because it's this complete unknown. It's this thing that we created, but is yet sort of absolutely outside of our control, or a situation we created, but that's yet completely outside of our control. And I kind of like that. And I'm not sure how that relates back to your question. It's more, I think, about this whole idea of an ecosystem and of us being in absolute symbiosis with this entire organism that is the planet. And not being able to separate our actions from these sort of external things that we then study as though they're natural. And I use the scare quotes quite deliberately.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to point out that we're talking about land, because of this idea that we're part of like a continuum, actually. So to separate off one separate thing, and also the one thing that seems easier to put into enclosures, even if you think of historically the enclosures, whereas things like water, we don't have a sense that we can sort of take possession or fence it off in the same way.
Or control it. I mean, look at one of the pieces here, the deluge, it was shot in a waterfall in Scotland that we literally walked across on the way out. And this was the first weekend in October where swathes of Scotland were flooded. And as we came back, we couldn't even go near it. So the piece, it'll come back soon, reimagines that waterfall in a state of, in the state that it was in when we had re-encountered it.
But I think it's interesting that people are asking this question more. Like, so for example, earlier this year, or last year, we're in 2024 now, in 2023, there was a really small publication of lots of young photographers, and they got together. There's lots of like really quite lyrical images of the landscape, which are documentary. It's not that they're like trying to mess with the surface, but they chose to call it Common Ground, which I found really interesting. They had the idea of working together as a collective, but also that the land is something that is it's not the possession of one particular individual. So yeah, I think that is an interesting point.
I mean, possession and individual are two really problematic words. Not that I'm saying, because it's a shorthand that we all default to, and it's the sort of things that we've got to pick ourselves up on and say, actually, it's not about. It shouldn't be about possession. It obviously is about possession, but yeah. I'm
thinking about Sky Hopinka now, who's an American artist with like Native American heritage. He made a work called The Land Describes Itself. So the idea that it's the land that speaks, and that we don't necessarily have to depict it in a certain way, because the land can speak for itself.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting as well, to sort of distance from this anthropocentric way of perceiving the earth and the landscape, to thinking what these entities themselves have about them.
Yeah, and how we can, I don't want to sound completely sort of new age, but how we can act as kind of conduits, or how we can channel what the land perhaps wants to say to us.
Or just be more respectful, actually. Yeah.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah, working more in collaboration rather than kind of,
Are there any other questions? We can talk forever, as you can see.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diane and Eugénie, this is directed for Victoria.
Okay.
Hearing you explain the context of Baton Rouge, that was really interesting to hear, but I think as an aesthetic, I'm very, very interested in it. And I must ask, the pink in the Polaroids, was that inherent to the landscape, or was that a chemical process?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, actually. A bit of both. In the sense that obviously Polaroids don't normally come out pink. I was using a very old camera that belonged to my grandfather, and that I knew before I went to those spaces was a problematic well, potentially problematic in the sense that it leaks light into it. But I decided to embrace that entropy and that kind of the accidental things that could happen with that camera. And by taking it to those spaces, the spaces that I was photographing are, I mean, they're not that color pink, but they're certainly reds and pinks and purples, because the caput mortuum, which is this residue from the pyrite treatment, that's what it leaves on the surface of the earth, is these really particular colored pigments, because it's mixed with iron oxide and different things to extract the useful parts of it. And so what was happening was that as I'm taking the photograph, not only is the light leaking in, but some of that caput mortuum, so some of that pigment is also sort of involved in the process of making that very quick sort of Polaroid image. And I didn't really know exactly what was going to happen, but that was the result. The result was these, what I thought were very beautiful pink Polaroids that I could probably never reproduce again, you know, except in those very specific conditions. And again, it's that idea that I'm not totally in control and that the landscape itself is contributing, you know, is conversing with me or is alive in a way, you know, through the heat, through the pigment, through the colors, through light, etc., you know. Okay.
I saw another question here in the middle. Yeah.
I'll make up something quick. Chemistry. Within the word chemistry, there's the word mystery. Could you say something about your fascination with chemicals, but also that being a destructive element, but also in the mystery, perhaps there's a creative matrix element within that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I work with expired film is because the chemicals in the film have transformed, and that I can't control what comes out. You know, if I'm lucky, well, I don't even know if it's, no, actually, I enjoy it when things happen that I had no idea. The same with, a lot of these works are made just on a copy machine. So the film will get, I shoot exclusively on film, that will get scanned, and then it will get output. The copying is something I started to do during the pandemic because I had no access to making prints in any other way. And I really enjoyed the randomness of it. So yeah, chemistry for me is something that has its own agency, and that I don't really have that much control over.
But what I think is interesting, though, I mean, and certainly I know that a lot of people, I mean, if you think that Photo50 is in some way, or this is what somebody once said to me, so, you know, that it kind of takes the temperature of kind of what is going on in contemporary photography right now in a very kind of raw way. And I like the idea of that, and the fact that a lot of us, me included, are really interested in not minimizing the chemistry, but using it more as an alchemy, you know, as a transformation of something, and also to minimize that kind of toxic quality that it has. So certainly for me, that's really important, using kind of non-toxic processes, so non-toxic solar plates that I can develop in the landscape without leaving a toxic mark on that landscape, you know, using river water or seawater, etc. And then also trying not to reproduce those onto papers or other surfaces that also have their own toxicity, so using recycled papers. So I think that chemistry that you're talking about, that is so intrinsic to the beginning, the middle, the end of, you know, what photography is now being reconsidered in a very important way in order to think about how we can reduce that toxicity of it and turn it more into this alchemical process, maybe, that has that mystery that you talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about alchemy and chemistry as well, because let's say if we're arguing, you know, photography has its roots in the Renaissance and the sort of discovery of a different way of thinking about the world and how we as humans might understand it is to do with like the development of modern science as well. Yeah. So when alchemy kind of mutated into chemistry and a particular way of looking at the world, Martin Jay in the 80s talked about the invention of a kind of scientific way of looking at the world, which is a distancing way of looking at the world as well. And if you think about, you know, old medical theatres where people would sit in an audience and look at the subject, Yeah, I think there's some link between like our modern scientific method, which obviously in many ways has been incredibly helpful. It's not that I want to chuck out science altogether, but maybe we need to think more about that particular way of looking at the world and how deeply embedded it is in our society. And is it always useful, or are there other alternative ways of seeing which we also sometimes need to draw on?
I mean, scientific rationality is really locked into the same ways of thinking that gave us linear perspective. It's that distancing. You know, before sort of the Enlightenment, doctors would often, you know, diagnose by like literally tasting and feeling. They still use palpation and stuff like that, but it was a much more deeply sensory practice. And I mean, Michel Foucault writes about this in The Order of Things, about this transition from this sort of magical world of alchemy where, you know, the fact that a walnut looked like a bit like a brain meant that it was good for diseases of the brain, was replaced with a much more taxonomical, hierarchical, ordered system that again was based on distance and organization. And, you know, the perspectival grid is all part of that as well, because it began, perspectival systems began with people literally drawing grids. Dührer's etchings of perspective machines that he did in the 15th century? 16th, are a really good example of this rationalization of the world. But it was across the board. It was, you know, it was in the visual arts, it was in the sciences, it was in medicine.
I guess what, you know, with the acceleration of all this technology and all that, you know, and science in a way being involved in kind of how technology is used and what it's used for and what we're looking at and looking for, I'm just thinking that maybe what a lot of us are doing now is and I'm coming right back to what you started off with, Eugénie, perhaps, is an idea of slowing it down. It's a kind of resistance to that acceleration and just slowing it down and allowing people to really look and really observe and then that allows that space for a kind of counter history or a counter understanding of what we're looking at, maybe through touch again. So that sense that screens are taking us away from the haptic, you know, to a sense of the optic. That's what photography often encourages, is the optic, that illusion of the space, and then actually thinking about or rethinking the materiality of the surface of the image, you know, actually touching it and what that can mean in a world where we're not encouraged to touch. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
I think that's really interesting. Like as images become more and more prevalent, you know, everyone has a camera in their pocket now with their phone, and we spend more and more time looking at images. So we are living our lives more and more with images. But have we really considered what images are and how they encourage us to look at the world? So maybe, like, I totally agree that that's the thing, maybe to slow down. It's like the sort of society of the spectacle, but that was written in '68, and now things are so much more intensively image-based. But also the idea of taxonomies I find really interesting as well. Like in a natural history museum, if they are sort of classifying species, they'll have like one model example, which is the imago, and that is like the kind of the model of the species that all others are then kind of compared with. So each individual one is, it's almost as if the imago is the negative, and then you can endlessly generate new
positives.
iterations. So each individual body or creature is just another copy in a very kind of, it seems very similar to me to, you know, making hundreds of cans of soup from what were like individual tomatoes, which were all slightly different to each other.
It was a way of managing chaos, I guess, which you know, the pre-Enlightenment world was really, you know, it was down with chaos. It loved it. It was like, God made chaos, so we've got to live with it. But, you know, as soon as you secularize things, anyway, I think we're out of time.
we'll have to end it there.
This could continue forever in a day.
Diane's beautiful question.
We're only just getting started.
What are images? Thank you very much.
Thank you.